Hey guys, what's up? It's munclesonkey. So I just want to warn you before we start this video, I'm going to be going over a lot of information and numbers in terms of how abilities work and how some of them were changed with the recent legacy update and how my ability bars are set up and which ability bars I would recommend for you guys to use for most situations. So if you find some of this information boring and if you just want to see the ability bars or just want to hear about a certain one, you can scroll down to the description and I have timestamps that you can click on and it will put you at certain parts of the video which give you the information you want to know. But anyway, without further ado, let's head into the ability bars and show you guys how abilities work. Okay, so the first combat style that we're going to be going over ability-wise is melee, and this is because it's melee escape. So with melee, there are obviously a lot of abilities since you both have attack and strength abilities, so there really are a lot to choose from, and of course there are a few abilities that I left out of my ability bar here, which are pretty decent, but I'm going to try to go over all the abilities on my ability bar and why I chose them. So the first ability I chose on my ability bar is Slice. It only does 110% damage, which isn't a lot of weapon damage, but it has a 3-second cooldown, so it's absolutely necessary for adrenaline game. The second ability that I have is Sever, 188% weapon damage and reducing any damage that they deal by 10% for 5 seconds. The only reason I have this on here is because of the 188% weapon damage. Sever also only has a 15-second cooldown now, so that has changed a little bit. It used to be longer than that, but it's a pretty good damage dealing ability. Now the next one here is probably going to be the first, at least somewhat, topic of debate, and I decided to put Fury on here instead of Havoc, because Havoc now does not share a cooldown with the Decimate ability, which is the next one, which means you can put both of them on an ability bar and use both of them. But the problem with Havoc is it only uses 125% of weapon damage, which is only slightly more than Slice. And Fury uses 3 attacks in basically about the same amount of time that you can use 2 regular attacks, since it uses 3 attacks with 1 ability strike. And it does 75% on the first weapon damage, but it does 3 attacks and they increase by 7% damage with each attack. Overall, it comes to 246% weapon damage over 3 game ticks, which is actually better weapon damage than using Slice and Havoc in that same amount of time. So that's why I put Fury on there, and I really like the ability. It does quite well. It basically does the exact same thing that the Concentrated Blast ability does for Mage, so this one was changed a little bit as well. And the final ability that I have for my basics, and I have this one as well, but the final one that I have of my first 4 basics is Decimate. It does 188% weapon damage, or 244% if they're wearing a shield. However, for killing monsters, they're not going to be wearing a shield, so it basically does the same thing as Sever, it just doesn't reduce their damage. So it's just a good high damage basic ability. Next we have Destroy, and this of course is for dual wield melee. I would always recommend to use dual wield melee. If you have 2H melee, you would put Hurricane on here instead. Destroy is much better than Hurricane, we'll just say that, and it's the main reason why you want to use dual wield melee. So it's 188% weapon damage over 6 seconds. It also binds the target. It only stuns in the first hit now. That was changed. It used to stun on all 4 hits, but now only the first one stuns. But it's just a very high damage attack. It's basically like using Decimate 4 times in rapid succession. And the next one after that is Assault. Assault does not stun, but it does 219% weapon damage. Now you might think this is better than Destroy, but Assault actually has quite a long startup animation, whereas Destroy starts much quicker, so overall Destroy is very similar in damage, even though it does a little bit less number-wise. And now for my first ultimate is Berserk. The Berserk ability is amazing in nearly all situations and should be your go-to ultimate for melee. There are a few situations where you don't want to use Berserk, but unless you're doing some kind of PVM, if you're just slaying or killing monsters, you always want to use Berserk as your ultimate. It increases your damage by 100%, so it doubles your damage for 20 seconds, and it also increases the damage you take by 50% and reduces your armor. And so the next ability I have on here is Escape. That's just for Calfight King and X, don't worry about that. And the ability after that is Blood Tendrils. You do need 75 attack to unlock this, and you can get this from talking to the guy at the dig site down in the Archaeological Exam Center. If you talk to the head archaeologist there, he'll give you a book and you read it, and it unlocks all the tendril abilities, which I'd highly recommend doing, and all you need is the dig site quest complete to do that. Blood Tendrils does 180% weapon damage, which is quite high, and then 4 hits with 90% weapon damage. So overall, it does quite a bit of damage over 5 seconds. It does damage you a little bit, but not a whole lot. The hits that it gives to you are usually in the 200-300 range. They're pretty minimal, so as long as you have a decently high HP, Blood Tendrils is a great ability to use. The only tendril ability that really hits you hard is the range one, so don't worry too much about the blood. The next ability that I have on here is a basic for when all 4 of these are on cooldown at the same time, which is very rare and will almost never happen. However, just in case, I have the Dismember ability here, and it is 188% weapon damage, but it's over 6 seconds, so you want to either use this on a monster with high HP or at the very start of monster kill, and that's the reason why it's not one of my favorite ultimate or basic abilities to use. And after that, my next ability is Slaughter. Slaughter is amazing. It does 5 hits with 100 to 250% weapon damage, tripling if the target moves. So if you're fighting a monster which moves, such as like an Abbey Demon, for example, it teleports around a lot, this ability can do absolutely crazy damage. Another thing that you can do with it, if you're using it on a monster that uses melee and has to walk around to attack you, you can use Slaughter and then back off. Slaughter will hit it really hard. If you're using it on a monster that is ranged, you can use Slaughter on it and then walk under it, making the monster move and tripling the damage. It's really great. And now for the ultimate time. I use Massacre as my second ultimate because it's really good at Calfight King. However, if you're fighting a boss like Nex or a Corp, or a boss that hits you really hard, I would recommend to use Pulverize, because Pulverize doesn't do as much damage as Massacre, but it does reduce their damage dealt to you by 25% for 30 seconds, which can be kind of nice, save you some food. Also, if you kill an NPC with Pulverize, you get 50% adrenaline, which is amazing, retaining 50% adrenaline after using an ultimate. Other ultimates that you can use are Frenzy. Frenzy, the only real time I found that's decent to use that is if you're melee in the Zeros phase during Nex, because you don't want to Zerk then. That's really the only time I would recommend to use Frenzy. And you can also use Meteor Strike, which I have never found a good time at all to use Meteor Strike. And then there's Balance Strike as well, which can be decent. You can use this to heal yourself. If you have low HP and you're fighting a monster with high HP, you can use Balance Strike on it and it'll heal you and do a decent amount of damage to your target. However, you can also damage yourself with this ability if used incorrectly. Like if the monster that you're killing has lower HP than you do, the Balance Strike will heal the monster and hit you. The only place that I've found that Balance Strike is really good to use is at Tormented Demons. And then to finish off my melee ability bar, I just have Protect, Range, and Mage. That's for Calfight King and Nex, just switching prayers. The only other thing I wanted to touch on really quick about the melee ability bar is the other thresholds that I left out. I left out Flurry, which can be good at QBD for killing the tortured souls, and also at Eretz from stopping their combo attack. Other than that, I've never found a good place to use Flurry. There's also a couple new thresholds with the Forceful Backhand and the Stomp, which are 2 stun abilities, which now do just 200% weapon damage, but they're not as good as the other melee thresholds, so I wouldn't really recommend using them. There's also Quake, which just does 188% weapon damage to all adjacent targets, and it requires a 2H sword. If you're fighting a group of enemies that are all swarming around you, it can be decent, but other than that, it's not really worth using, and it's not really that great. Okay, and now we move on to the range abilities. There's not really a whole lot of differing range abilities that you can use. For the most part, the action bar that I have is what you're going to want to use. There's a couple abilities that you can switch out, and I'll try to talk about them here. But for the most part, range doesn't have nearly as many abilities to choose from as mage. The first ability that we have is Piercing Shot, which does 94% weapon damage. This is just your basic, your slice of the ranged ability bar. So you're going to use this mostly for adrenaline gain, and it does extra weapon damage if the target is stunned. The next base we have is Snipe. I would not ever recommend using this. You can use it for adrenaline gain, I guess, if you want, but it takes a really long time to fire. You have to wait for nearly a full 2 seconds just to do the shot off. I wouldn't recommend it. Next we have Binding Shot, which does 100% weapon damage, so it doesn't do super high damage. However, if you hit an enemy with a Binding Shot, you can get 2 piercing shots off in that time when the enemy is bound, and they'll do extra damage. So it's kind of nice for monsters. You can hit them with the Frag Shot, Bind, Piercing Shot, and it'll do extra damage. That's what I usually do. The next one is Needle Strike. This is a dual wield only, does 150% weapon damage, which is pretty good. If you're using 2H range, you're going to be using Dazing Shot again, which has the same amount of damage. It just decreases the accuracy instead of decreasing the enemy's damage dealt. And the next ability after that is Frag Shot. This is probably the best range basic ability. You hit your target with 100 to 188% weapon damage over 6 seconds, so very similar to the Dismember ability from the melee ability bar. However, if your target moves location, it doubles the damage, which can be really, really nice. If you're fighting, for example, Necreals, which are a task I use range on, they melee, so you just hit them with the Frag Shot, and all of the hits are double damage because they move automatically to get closer to you. And the final range basic, other than Escape just moves you backwards 7 spaces. Escape hits a target and rebounds and hits a couple other targets, which does 100 damage each. It's decent in situations where there's a lot of enemies around you, like for example Rarari are a good place to use. It is a good place to use Ricochet, but it's not really great anywhere else. And I guess Calfight King minions, areas like that where there's a lot of enemies that around you that you want to kill. So for thresholds, the first threshold that I have is Rapid Fire. This fires a whole bunch of shots over 6 seconds, does really, really good DPS. And after that, with a Snapshot threshold ability, which does a 100 to 120% weapon damage first shot and 100 to 210% weapon damage on your second shot. So it fires 2 shots at once, does really good damage, and I would recommend to use this pretty often. It's really good on places, especially when you have to move around a lot, like for example Calfight King Mage Phase. Snapshot does absolute work there. So your main range ultimate that you want to be using is Death Swiftness. You do have to complete the World Wakes quest for this, but it increases your damage dealt by 50% for 30 seconds. And any targets inside the cloud, there's this giant death cloud around you, get hit for a very slight amount of damage. And the next one is Shadow Tendrils. Again, you unlock this the same way that you unlock the Melee Tendrils ability. It does really high damage, but also hits you quite hard, so you want to use this on an area where you can either soul split or heal up fairly easily. And don't use this on a boss when you're low HP. Don't YOLO Tendrils, or you could die. The next one I have on here is Freedom. That's just for Calfight King. Same reason I have Escape on the ability bar. And the other ultimate that I have on here, I only use this very, very rarely, just if Death Swiftness is on cooldown really, is Unload. It does a very good amount of damage over 6 seconds. You fire 5 shots at your target, doing a lot of weapon damage. I would always recommend to use Death Swiftness though over Unload, unless you're in a situation where you can't use Death Swiftness, if it's either on cooldown or if you're in an area where you have to be running around all the time. Incendiary Shot is the 2H specific ultimate, and I wouldn't really recommend this one. It's not that great, although its critical strikes can give you a bit of extra adrenaline gain, which is nice. And the final ultimate that you can use is Deadshot, which is a decent amount of damage over 6 seconds, but Unload does better damage. And of course, Death Swiftness is the go-to ability. So the only ability I really left out here is Tight Bindings, which does the same as the regular Binding Shot, but it's double the damage. But I wouldn't really recommend using this one because I use Binding Shot for adrenaline gain. I don't like to use Ricochet for adrenaline gain because there's a lot of places where you don't want to use Ricochet because you don't want multiple targets on you. So I use the Binding Shot for adrenaline gain a lot, and that's why I don't want to use the Tight Bindings, because it makes you lose adrenaline instead of gaining adrenaline, and it's a threshold. And now we move on to the final ability bar out of the 3 combat styles, which is Mage. And Mage is my favorite ability style to use, so I really like using Mage a lot, and some of these abilities are very powerful. So let's go over the abilities again. The first one is Rack. The Rack ability is, again, your basic adrenaline gaining ability, 3-second cooldown. You can use this one a lot, so it's a must. The second one is Combust. It does basically the same thing as the Frag Shot does for the range ability bar. Decent amount of damage. Also, if the target moves location, they suffer double damage. So it's really, really good on places like Glacier minions. That's my favorite place to use it. The next ability here is Sonic Wave, which will deal 150% of your spell damage on the spell's attack. Or if you're using Dual Wield Mage, you would use Concentrated Blast instead, which does the exact same thing as the Fury ability from the Melee ability bar does, and I've already gone over that one. Now this one I actually do end up using the Threshold Impact instead of the regular Impact, and you see for Mage, or for range and melee, I did not use any of these threshold stun abilities, but for mage I do. And that's because I don't have as big of a problem with adrenaline gain as range, because I have one more basic on my bar for mage than I do for range, so I find it easier to gain adrenaline. And that ability that I have on my ability bar is Dragon Breath, which does 188% damage, and it covers a huge area. Dragon Breath is recently updated, so it hits targets in, I believe, a 9x9 area or 3x3 area, something like that. But it covers a very, very large area and will hit a lot of targets. I find this ability is really good at, again, Glacier minions, or for example, if you're cannoning Dagonos, Dragon Breath absolutely hits a ton of them, and it's amazing to use. And the final basic I have on here, other than Freedom, is Chain, and Chain will just hit targets. It does the same thing as the Ricochet ability on the range spell bar. It hits targets around you, so it's decent in areas that have a lot of targets surrounding you that you actually want to hit. Again, good at Glacier minions. So for the thresholds, the first one I have is Deep Impact, which does the exact same thing as the regular impact. It just stuns your target, and it also does double the damage of regular impact, which is the reason why I have it and not the regular one on my ability bar. And the first good threshold that I have is Asphyxiate, which does 4 hits of high damage and also stuns the target that you're hitting on the first attack. So it's basically like Destroy off the melee ability spell bar, but the damage isn't calculated the same because magic damage is calculated different than melee damage. If you want to find out how that's calculated, I'll have a link in the description. And the next ability that I have threshold wise is Wild Magic. It does 2 high hits. It's similar to the snapshot of the range ability bar, but again, it doesn't have the same numbers. It is more wild, as the title goes, Wild Magic, between 50 and 250% of damage on those hits. And the final threshold that I have on this ability bar is Smoke Tendrils. I don't exactly know how this one goes because I haven't used it a whole lot. It does a decent amount of damage over time. I'll just say that. You unlock it the same way that you unlock the other tendril abilities. And so I only have one ultimate on my magic spell bar, and that's because I only really have one ultimate that I feel is worth using, and that's Sunshine. Again, you unlock this one off the World Wakes quest. If you haven't done World Wakes, put Metamorphosis on your ability bar instead of Sunshine. Metamorphosis does the same thing, but Sunshine lasts 10 more seconds. However, with Metamorphosis, you can run around, and Sunshine, you have to stay within the sunlight. Again, it does the same thing as Death Swiftness, basically doing a little bit of extra damage to enemies if they stand inside the Sunshine beam. And also on my magic ability spell bar, I have the vulnerability spell. It increases damage done to enemies by 10% for 1 minute. If you're using magic for PV, I mean, vulnerability is an absolute must, so make sure you have it on there. And if you go to bosses and use magic, make sure you bring chaos runes and soul runes, as vulnerability is going to increase your damage, and vulnerability lasts a minute, so you have to use it again after a minute, but it's totally worth it. Anyway, this video was really long, so I do apologize for that, but hopefully I went over all the abilities in depth. I did leave out a few magic ultimate abilities and didn't talk about a couple of them, and that's the abilities that I didn't talk about aren't worth using, like, for example, Detonate, Tsunami, just absolute crap abilities like that you should not use. But the ones that I did talk about, hopefully I explained why they're good and also for the most part what they do. So thanks for watching, guys, and farewell.